Are you struggling to figure out what to plant and when in Florida's crazy gardening seasons? The UF IFAS Planting Guide is your best friend, if you know how to use it. In today's video, I'm going to break down exactly how to read it so you can know exactly what to plant and when all year round. Let's get into it. So what exactly is the UF IFAS Planting Guide? It's a table within a very popular document published by UF IFAS called Florida Vegetable Gardening Guide. I'll put a link to it in the description box below so you can read the entire document. The mission of UF IFAS Extension is to take that university research and spread the knowledge to our counties and our constituents throughout the entire state of Florida. Every county in Florida has a UF IFAS Extension office, and that's a great resource for all kinds of gardening questions and advice. Now, although this gardening guide is readily available on the internet for anyone who tries to look for it, it can be a little bit hard to understand at the beginning. Let's start looking at the table and I'll decipher the columns as we go. Here's a screenshot of the top portion of the planting guide. It goes on and on for so many rows that I can't fit it on a screen and still make it legible. So throughout this video, I'm going to be sharing screenshots of different parts of this table and talking through what exactly each piece means. If you look across the top, there's 12 columns, so let's get started with the very first one. The very first column is the crop. There are over 30 different vegetable crops listed in this table. What you won't see are fruit and nut trees. Now, whenever you're ready to dive into the next level of this, there's a second table in the gardening guide that's suggested varieties of all of these crops. I'll put a link to that table in the description box below. Moving on, you'll see the next few columns, planting dates in Florida outdoors with footnote 1. The word outdoors is very important because this is when the weather is right to support that crop. If you wanted to start some seeds earlier than this in a seed starting tray, you could do so probably indoors. More on that in a bit. The most obvious question that comes along when looking at these columns is, what do they define as North Florida, Central Florida, and South Florida? Now, according to footnote 1, they have defined North Florida as everything north of State Road 40. Central Florida is south of State Road 40 and north of State Road 70. South Florida is defined as everything south of State Road 70. I'm in Melbourne, Florida, which is right in the middle of Central, so the examples I'm going to give today are geared towards Central Florida. If you live in the boundary between two areas, feel free to use either date. You'll notice that the dates differ a little bit between North, Central, and South Florida. If you think about it, there's a good reason for that. North Florida gets quite a bit colder than South Florida ever does. As you look through the table and you're looking at the dates, you can observe some crops that fall kind of into a few different categories. We have some crops that have 2 seasons of growing. You'll see ones that say plant in January through March, and then that same crop also has a growing season in the fall where it says plant in September or October. These crops tend to be our large fruiting crops like cucumbers, eggplants, peppers, tomatoes, and squash. You'll also see a few should be planted during the summer months, like okra and sweet potatoes. The list is kind of slim in the summer months, as you can imagine, because it just gets so hot in Florida. And lucky for us, most popular root veggies, leafy greens, and brassicas can be grown all the way from fall till spring. So take a look at carrots, radishes, lettuce, kale, and broccoli. All of those can be planted in about October all the way through about February. There's 2 crops I want to mention in this table that have very specific planting times, and that's bulbing onions and strawberries. Bulbing onions are usually planted in the fall and harvested in the spring. Strawberries, unlike the rest of the country, our strawberry season is in the winter. So we plant these strawberries in about October, and then we're harvesting them all the way through maybe March. We treat them as annuals in Florida, and we actually replant strawberry plants every year. The next 2 columns are yield and plant spacing per 10 feet of row. Per 10 feet of row is a common term used in agriculture that may or may not be helpful for you. It works well when talking about an in-ground row garden, but not so well when talking about a raised bed. I use raised beds, and I tend to go with square foot gardening spacing recommendations. The yield per 10 foot of row column will help you understand which crops produce the most using the least amount of land. An easy example is bush beans versus pole beans. Bush beans grow short and bush-like, and pole beans will grow up with vines extending sometimes 10 feet long. So although the pole beans don't take up much space in the ground, you're gonna need to think about trellising them. The plants per 10 foot of row column is intended to help the home gardener figure out how many seeds or transplants to buy. Seed packets will normally state how many seeds are in it, so you should be able to estimate how many packets to buy. The next column is days to harvest. The footnote explains that it means days from seed sowing to first harvest, except when parentheses are used, and then it's transplanting to first harvest. Now, if you look at these numbers, some of these crops have a pretty wide range of days to harvest. Take a look at beets, for example. It says beets are ready 50 to 70 days after sowing seeds in the garden. Now, that's a 20-day difference on a relatively short-term crop. One reason for the range could be the amount of sunlight. Beets are typically planted from September to about February in Central Florida. So I looked up the max sunlight hours for my zip code in Florida, and you can see how the max sunlight hours vary quite a bit from September to December. In September, there's about 2 hours of sunlight more each day than there is in December. So that could certainly impact the number of days to harvest. The next two columns can be looked at together since they're both about plant spacing. The plants column provides guidelines about how far apart each individual plant should be from the other. For example, you can sow arugula seeds 3 to 4 inches apart from each other. The rows column is only relevant if you're planting in rows. The values in the table represent how far apart the rows should be from each other. The footnote explains that the row spacing can be ignored as long as the plant spacing is correct. So for example, when planting in rows, your arugula in one row should be 3 to 4 inches apart with the rows 10 inches apart. If planting in a raised bed, you simply need to make sure your oregano seeds are 3 to 4 inches apart in all directions. The next column is seed depth. Whether you're direct sowing the seeds right into the garden or you're putting them in seed starting cells, use these seed depth guidelines to make sure you don't plant too deep. If you plant your seed too deep, it won't have the energy to actually sprout above the surface of the soil. As a general rule of thumb, the bigger the seed, the deeper you should plant it. The next column might be my favorite column of all. It's called the transplantability column. Transplantability is described as the ability of the seedling to be successfully transplanted. This is your cheat sheet for knowing whether to direct sow or transplant that crop. If it has Roman numeral 1 in the column, that means it easily survives transplanting. If it has a rating of 2 in that column, it means it sometimes survives transplanting if you're careful. If it has a Roman numeral of 3 in that column, it means you should only plant seeds or containerized transplants with developed root systems. Let's look at an example. Today is December 18th, and if I were looking at this guide through the lens of trying to prepare for my spring garden, I would see that beans, cucumbers, and squash can all be planted in January through March in my garden, but they have a transplantability rating of 3. So if I wanted to do some seed starting soon for my spring garden, these would not be good candidates. Instead, what I'm going to do to prepare for my spring garden is just order the seeds right now and have them ready for that January to March timeframe. Now, if you keep looking at this table, you'll see that eggplants, tomatoes, and peppers can all also be planted January or February and March in Central Florida. Except these ones have a transplantability rating of 1. So it would be really smart for me to go ahead and start my eggplant, tomato, and pepper seeds in a seed starting tray. Now, eggplants, tomatoes, and peppers are frost sensitive, so if you're going to start them in seed starting cells outside, make sure you're ready to bring them inside when there's a risk of a frost overnight. Alternatively, you could just start them inside. The last column is plant family. This column is included to help you do crop rotation. The footnote explains that we should avoid successively planting vegetables from the same plant family in the same spot in the garden. Here's an example of a common crop rotation cycle. Crop rotation is the practice of planting different crops in the same area of land over time. It's a technique used to improve the soil and control pests and diseases. Crops with the same plant family will have similar needs as far as nutrients, pests, and diseases. Some crops, like beans for example, will put nutrients back into the soil so that your heavy feeders can be planted afterwards. Now that you know how to read the table, I'm confident that you know how to plant the right plants at the right time. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button below. I'll see you next time, guys.